Alright everybody, welcome back to Ukraine War Stories. I enjoyed this so much that I'm just gonna jump from the last episode, the first episode that we did, directly into this one. I enjoyed myself so much with this. And we're gonna do Hostomel again, but we're gonna do different choices. It was barely past 1700, but it was getting dark already. Spring was on its way in, but we were still getting early sunsets and cold nights. Another quiet evening in the house that was entirely too big for just me and Lilia. Ever since our daughter had settled in Kiev. No surprises there, Hostomel was always too small for her. Still, she kept in touch with us. In fact, that evening I was just trying to figure out a present from her. A smartphone. Well, I wasn't trying anymore. I delegated the task to the neighbor's girl, Milena Mirzian. Milena is a bright girl, who I consistently have a problem with calling Milenia. Top of her class at Medical University in Kiev. Much younger than my own daughter Katya. Barely in her 20s, quick-fitted and full of life. Vim and vigor, unlike me. A tired old man. I've been an aviation engineer for 40 years before retiring, and yet these modern gadgets are beyond anything I have ever worked with. Now my wife, Lilia, she is the savvy one, but that evening she was preoccupied. Oleski, she said in a worried voice. Oleski, have you heard what Putin's saying? He recognized those republics in Russia and Donbass. She clutched at her chest. Oh God, the Russians are going to invade. I looked over to see her watching a Russian broadcast on YouTube. I could only roll my eyes. For the last few weeks, what Putin was saying was everyone's favorite gossip. That a big war was coming. That the Russians were finally going to invade in full force. That's why Milena left Kiev a day ago and came to join her parents in Hostomel. Many people fled the capital in the last few days. It was as if everybody expected Kiev to be burned off the face of the earth. Lilia, please. Nothing's going to happen, I said. Then I caught Milena's glance. Wrong words. She was afraid too. Mr. Borisov, they've got so many troops on our borders. They wouldn't keep them there if they were just bluffing. That's exactly how a bluff works, child. I joked. We have nothing to fear because we still do that. Because I don't think those will change any outcomes anyway, no matter what I say. So if Putin recognizes those republics, don't you think that's all he's after? He's keeping forces on our borders to keep our line stretched thin, so that he can easily take Donbass and freeze the war for another 8 years. I tried giving the girls a reassuring smile. In retrospect, it may have looked a little smug. You know, at least I took first aid courses and stocked us up on some gauze. That'll be useful, right, darling? She looked at Milena, who replied with enthusiastic nodding. You could have done something useful as well instead of buying more model planes. I just chuckled. I could tell she was just worried, but I didn't mean it. But she didn't mean it one bit. Look, if you're so worried, I'll go get the car filled up. Say, on Thursday? We weren't using our car much, except to buy groceries, so the near empty tank didn't seem like an issue. With my bum leg, I barely left home anyway, and Lilia worked as a teacher. Her students were all on distance learning. Then we will go on vacation to the Carpathians. A week, no, 2 weeks, until this whole ordeal resolves itself, and you will see I was right. Stocking up on fuel is a good idea, Milena chimed in. My dad is stocking up as well, before the prices rise even more. I nodded. I didn't believe war was coming. And if it did, could I do anything to prevent it? But there was something I could do. Help everyone stay calm. The first day of war. There was a deafening noise outside, wresting me from sleep instantly. At first, I didn't believe my own ears. I thought I hadn't woken up at all, and this was all a nightmare. But then, I heard the noise again. Explosions. Oh God, Loishka. They are bombing the airfield. Look, those helicopters are shooting rockets. I looked around and saw my wife. She was already running towards the window. Did she hear it first? She was always quicker thinker than I was. After a night of sleep, stepping on my bum leg felt even worse than usual. I limped towards Lily and looked out the window. I didn't have the eyesight to make out the details, but I saw helicopters swarming over Hostomel airfield, launching bright flares all around them. Not rockets, flares. They do it so our soldiers do not shoot them down. They are fixing to deploy airborne troops. Lily covered the mouth with her hands and looked at me. I don't think I've ever seen so confused and scared. Pack our things. We might have to leave town. As my wife ran around the house, packing up everything of value, I was trying to process what was happening. The war had just begun. I had seen this with my own eyes, but I was still couldn't quite comprehend it. I was so convinced that the Russians would never attack upon the Reds. What a fool I've been. There was gunfire coming from the airfield. It snapped me back to reality. I had to do something. Then I wanted to check up on Lilia. I saw her hands were shaking. I had to calm her down, or at least make sure she didn't forget to pack anything important. On the other hand, I had never gotten around to refueling the car, and only had enough petrol to drive to the nearest fueling station. I'm gonna go with this time. Getting gasoline was my first priority. I got dressed, told Lilia where I was going, and then went to visit our closest neighbors. I knocked on their door, then called out a few times. Nothing. I swore silently and limped towards the next house. In about an hour, I'd visited all of our neighbors. Most of them had left town, while others were picking up or waiting for their relatives to join them. They all told me to evacuate as far as possible, somewhere abroad, or at least to the nearest western part of Ukraine. The Russians weren't going to get that far, they said. Naturally, nobody had any gasoline to spare. I was heading home and someone called out my name. It was David Mirzan, the neighbor whose house I had visited first. He had just came back home after stocking up on some groceries he had owned in town. Good day, Oleski. Have you seen how our boys kicked those Ruskies to the curb? He was merry and excited. He must have been thinking, must have been the nerves, I thought, while David kept talking. The Russians landed there airborne and left. Can you imagine? Left their troops to fend for themselves. Our boys destroyed them on the ground. I wasn't convinced. It sounded too good to be true. To snap David back to reality, I asked him about the gasoline. Oh, of course! Here you go. He got a full jerry can out of his car's trunk and gave it to me. But if I were you, I would stay put. They say Russians who survived scattered in the woods. Personally, I'd let our boys smoke them out first. David bid me farewell, to reassure his wife, who seemed to be scared, same as Lily was. And me, I believed him, and I stayed put. If I'm being honest, I just wanted to believe it will sort itself out within a couple of days. I will never forgive myself for not getting Lily out of Hostomel on the same day. Oh, Leski, what will he do? Lilia complained, sniffling away a last of her tears. Did you hear it? Did you hear how loud it was? It was terrible. I nodded and hugged Lilia closer. I sure heard it around 3 a.m. when we were sleeping in the basement. A shell hit our house. I didn't know what it was, but it shook the whole place. I was crawling around looking for my cane, wondering if we should stay put or run, while Lilia was covering her ears and screaming. Then, when we were sure the walls were tumbling down upon us, she started crying again. This would all be over soon, I hoped. But at that time, all I could do was hold her close. The very next morning, when the fighting had quieted down, I heard a knock on our basement door. Our neighbors had come to visit us. The whole Mirzian family, Milena and her parents. Oleskia, Livia! David, the father of the family, walked up to me and firmly shook my hand. How are you two doing? Are you alright? You saw your house get hit. Thank God Almighty you weren't there. No kidding. We have to leave, David. This is getting too dangerous. David's wife Olha chimed, I did it again. We can't leave, Oleski Fedorovich. We can't leave, Oleski Fedorovich. We've spoken with the Territorial Defense Office. They said it's too dangerous. There's already talk about Russians shooting cars. I wanted to curse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sure, the war has been going for 8 years now, but it was in Donbass, on the edge of town, on the edge of the country. Now, Russians were taking their planes and tanks and bombs all the way up to Kiev. I just shook my head. Tell me, did they take Antonov Airport? If they did, the road to Kiev would be wide open. We'd be seeing thousands, if not tens of thousands of men and vehicles rolling out over the next few days. No, my friend. They didn't. It's quite a story, really, David said, and motioned for his wife and daughter to carry on without him. They brought us some supplies and took them downstairs. David, meanwhile, told me the news. They had yet to make it to TV, but the gossip had already spread around town. The Russians took Antonov Airport, but it's all shelled to bits, unusable. They won't be landing anything there, or using the planes. I gasped as David cut himself off. He did not need to continue. Mirya too. Is it gone? I've worked for the Antonov Design Bureau for 40 years. Aviation was my life. Still is, however little of that life is still left in me. And nothing the Antonov Bureau ever made came even close to AN-225 Mira. The best cargo plane ever designed. A marvel of engineering. Soviet, Ukrainian, did not matter. Mira was a treasure. I thought it was terrible waste that it was barely flown for 3 decades of independence. But that day, I learned it was truly terrible waste. I felt a sting in my chest and clutched at it. David quickly rushed to support me. He helped me sit down on the ground. I couldn't talk at first, so he continued. What a rotten world, huh? I told my girl to wait outside. Wait out the war in Hostomel, if it came. And now the war has come here. He reached his jacket's inner pocket, and before I knew it, there was a bottle in his hand. I was appalled at first, drinking at a time like this, but David kept talking. Nothing is sacred to those Russians. Destroying Mira is bad enough, but do you know what they do to women? If Russians get here, if they do, I can't calm my girls down. I cannot protect them either. I do not have a gun. He reached to uncork the bottle, drawing my attention to it. It was the finest of Armenian cognac money could buy. So like, he's gonna die apparently inevitably anyway, it appears. Because the gas really doesn't yet seem to have a point. It could a lot later, but I don't think it does. Yeah, so I almost feel like David's morale doesn't matter. Yeah. Neither of these long-term are good choices, I feel like, because of the morals. But I think I'm going to do this one. Mira was a terrible loss. I didn't know what to think about it. But drowning my sorrow in alcohol was not an option. If David was so sure the war would only last a few days, I said, surely this Kondanak was better spent celebrating victory. David frowned, but had to agree. He even told me to keep the bottle. That way, he'd be sure it survived until our victory. He wasn't wrong there. I barely drank, and we never kept any alcohol at home. So when I came to the basement to stash the bottle, Lilia had some questions. It is a gift from David Mirzhan. It is a gift from David Mirzhan, he said. We'll open it when it is time to celebrate our victory, I said. I did not tell her about the mirror. Lilia gave me a sideways look, but soon realized I was being honest. She smiled. That's a wonderful idea. Give him my thanks. As the day grew to a close, me and David were parting ways just before curfew. Shots were already ringing out somewhere far. The night, like the one before it, was getting far too loud. Suddenly, we heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Oh, do you know? Our armed forces have finally arrived, David said and looked out onto the road. Then his face dropped. As the armored vehicles rolled down the road, we could see the bright white Z's painted on them. It has been a week since the war had begun. Just a week. An entire week. Time seemed to have slowed down. And every new day that came seemed longer and longer than the last. Deep inside, my fear was growing. Fear for myself, my family, my home, my country. Fear for the future. We heard bombs exploding outside, and wondered if the next one could hit us, and if we'd even survive it. This constant fear of death left us with nothing, neither energy nor willingness to do anything. All we did was keep checking the news. I don't know what we wanted to see there, but good news was in short supply. But any new information served to distract us from the horrors around us. That's what we were doing, sitting in our basement when my phone rang. Me and Lilia flinched from the sound. The happy melody our daughter picked for us, for the ringtone, sounded terribly out of place, sacrilegious even. It was David, I remember. Oleski! Hide your phone! The Ruskies are going around town, taking them away. He hung up, and I quickly hid the phone under the floorboards. David's timing was impeccable. Upstairs, in our house, what remained of it at least, we heard a loud crash and heavy footsteps. The Russians had broken into our home. We turned off the light, leaving me and Lilia in total darkness, and listened. Loishka, what do we do? Loishka, what do we do? Lilia whispered. I heard growing panic in her voice. In the dark, I found her hand and squeezed it. Be quiet. Maybe they'll leave us alone. We weren't so lucky. In a few moments, someone knocked on the basement door. It was with a heavy sound. They must have been knocking with the butt of a rifle. Open up! Quick, or we are breaking down the door. I didn't want to let the Russians in, but I didn't want to antagonize the armed men either. We either had to turn on the lights and open the door. 3 Russian soldiers descended into the basement. They were armed and looked ready to use their weapons at the drop of a hat. Lilia backed away from them, and so did I, using a wall to support. One of the soldiers noticed my limp. What's wrong with your leg, old man? Must have thought it was a combat wound. Hurts to step on it. An old injury. Spent half my life with a cane. He nodded and looked around the basement. We were searching the houses. Looking for Nazis and saboteurs. Do you know any Nazis in the city? Okay, so I did this before. I can do this. Or I can do this. Looks like this is probably the best bet for this time around. I knew he wouldn't be pleased if I told him there were no Nazis here. But what choice did I have? I couldn't throw my neighbors under the bus. Then again, many of them had left. I'd much prefer the Russians to wreck an empty house instead of shooting someone dead. There was a suspicious man around here, but we haven't seen him for a while now. I told the soldier to the address of an empty house. But the rest of us are good folks. We don't want to find any Nazis among them. The soldier looked at me with a squint and nodded. We'll check this information. You two, stay put where we work. If you leave the basement, you are getting shot. When the Russians left, Lily closed the door behind them and looked at me in fear. What if they come back and don't find anybody? My hands were shaking. But deep down I knew I had done the right thing. What was I supposed to do? At least this way they won't kill anybody. In reality, I wasn't sure at all. They were still fighting, but only on the outskirts. Lilia had never gotten used to it, but I did. There is still fighting was something I kept telling myself as I saw Russians rummage through neighbors' houses on the street. A unit of Chechens, Gedrovites, as they are called, even dropped by our house. There wasn't much to steal, but they stole it anyway. Me and Lilia had enough sense not to argue, and so they just took whatever they wanted and left. Then the Mirazons' turn hadn't come yet, but they knew they would not be so lucky. That's why I couldn't refuse David when he asked that his daughter stay with us a few days. Me and Lilia, we were just a tired old couple, and with my leg, it wasn't much of a threat. The Russians were done with this. Thank you so much, Elias. These people are monsters. David shared as Lily helped Milena make her way into our basement. Have you heard the word around town? Of course I had. The Russians took whatever they wanted. They ate anything that they could get their hands on, drank anything that could be drank, and took anything and everything that they could resell back home. I wasn't born yesterday. I expected as much. It was war. I could accept it. But what they did to women, I refuse to accept. Are you sure you do not want to join us, Olha? We'll make room, I offered. David shook his head. No, Fedorovich. You just keep Milena hidden for a few days, okay? Me and Olha will manage somehow. We'll be real quiet. He put his finger on his lips and smiled. I smiled back at him as he walked out onto the street. I waved him goodbye. Then there was a pop. Like a firecracker going off in the distance, David fell to the ground. He screamed. What I did next, I could never be proud of. I threw myself towards the basement entrance and slammed the door shut. Downstairs, Lilia yelped at the loud bang. My chest began to hurt and I clutched it with one hand. A second distant pop. The screaming stopped. I think I waited for hours. Milena was downstairs, covering her mouth and looking in mute horror. Looking with David's eyes. I think I waited for hours. When I finally walked through the door, slow and careful, making no sound. There was David, alright? And two Russians. One standing over David, the other rifling through his pockets. And what did you do that for? The standing one asked. He sounded calm, bored even. He was a Nazi, can't you tell? I know them when I see them. The other shrugged in the dark. He was not being serious. I could hear him grin. They laughed. Then they both lit themselves a cigarette. I closed the bathroom door and kept it closed throughout the night. Milena cried for hours. Lily held her hand and did the best not to cry herself. But in the morning, she too joined in when she heard Olha's wailing outside. Yeah, so because of the morale levels, right? I think if I had done the same thing I did before with drinking the cognac, sharing it with everybody, and then didn't do this, I would have been able to continue, but because everyone's at 2, it would have caused them to not want to go on, and so it would probably end the game there and they'd die anyway, because I give up hope, right? I've already done this before, but I think that this is still the best option, so I'm going to continue to do that. I could not leave my friend like that, so I got a shovel and crawled towards David. As I dug a grave for him, I had to stop at least 24 times. The air would get too hot, for the shots too loud, and the ground would shake so hard it would knock us off our feet. In the end, it was barely a grave. David's broad Armenian shoulders barely fit in. It seems like the earth just refused to believe he was dead, but it had to suffice. And while it was little relief for the girls, we did David good. The dogs were not going to get to him. By the 10th day of the war, our supplies were dwindling. Me and Lilia always tried to manage with little excess, and had very little food stocked up. I mean, why would we? The shops nearby had everything we needed. But now there were twice as many of us. The Mirzorians brought some of their own supplies with them, but it wasn't enough for 4 people. Someone had to get us some more supplies. Lilia didn't want to let me go. They were still fighting in Hostomel. Every day we heard explosions, machine gun fire and artillery barrages. My wife even began to plead to go look for supplies by herself, but I managed to talk her out of it. If anyone was going to take such a risk, it had to be me. I told her the Russians would never give me a second thought. There is no use in shooting an old cripple. It would be a waste of ammunition. I wasn't a threat to them at all. I was trying to convince myself as much of this as I was of her. Eventually, Lilia saw things my way, or at least pretended to. Olha and Milena talked very little in the last few days. David's death was very heavy on them. With him gone, they were all on their own. I had a double responsibility now. Milena cried a lot. Looking at the dark circles under her eyes, I thought David should have taken her somewhere else. Someone stronger and healthier. When the gunfire outside had quieted down, I took my cane and I grabbed my old backpack. Lilia, stay quiet down here and keep everyone inside. I'll be back soon, I promise. I will see if there's anything useful nearby, and I'll be right back. She nodded, barely holding back her tears. After what happened to David, she feared for my life even more. It was quiet outside, and after The dark, damp basement. The sunlight was blinding. When my eyes finally did adjust, I just had wished they didn't. Many houses on the street were ruined, either heavily damaged or simply completely gone. The intact ones had all been broken into and looted. The Russians took everything. Clothing, household appliances, tools, even children's toys. I couldn't understand what kind of person would do that. I saw ransacked cars everywhere. Many of them were even completely missing their wheels. Some were shot or even flattened by armored vehicles. Inside one such car, I saw someone's mangled remains. I looked away in horror and disgust. The streets were also full of bodies. People in civilian clothing were strewn about and amongst the debris like broken dolls. I had no idea why they were killed. Were they in the wrong place at the wrong time like David? Did it draw some anger? I refused to believe this was all happening on the streets of my Hostomel. And yet, I still had the task to complete. I had to decide to what to look for. We had a pressing need for many things, but with my leg, I would only manage a single purposeful trip. So, I still want to do the medicine. In fact, I can only do the medicine now. Because, we already have medicine. I guess that's why we can't do it. I guess? That's gotta be it, yeah. Because I could only do gas before. So, we're gonna go with medicines. I kept thinking about David. If he ever survived, we'd have nothing to treat his wound with. So I need to get some medicine. There was a pharmacy not far from our house. I decided to look there and check the abandoned houses along the way. Indeed, I managed to find some food and water there. Did that make me a looter? I hoped not. I didn't want to think of myself as one, so I made an effort to remember which things I took and where. This way I could compensate my neighbors after the war. As expected, the pharmacy was completely ransacked. Shattered windows were everywhere. Racks turned over and broken cash registers. The Russians had already liberated the place. And even threw themselves a little party, it seemed. On the floor, I saw empty bottles of ethanol. Eventually, I did find an unopened bottle of ethanol. It had rolled on the rack, and I was the first one to find it. In the back, I found the bandages and antibiotics. Thanking the Almighty for such luck, I packed everything into my backpack and hurried back home. As I walked back home, the fighting had resumed, and judging by the sounds, it was headed my way. I sped up to the best of my ability. A few times, the explosions would ring out, even just one street away, making the ground shake under my feet. I wanted to drop the supplies I found and try to run, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't come back home empty-handed. When I finally returned to my home safely, I couldn't believe my luck. It was already getting dark outside. My leg was on fire, and my back was killing me. But Lilia's adoring gaze made up for any discomfort. Her look made me feel like a young man again in his prime. For the first time in forever, I felt useful. Mobile connection down here was more often than it was not. Mobile connection was down more often than it was not. And even then, when we had to go outside to catch any. Even so, the gossip spread around Hostomel very quickly. The fighting had died down and the Russians had the free run of the town. And that's when the news started coming in. News I did not want to believe. People say the man was shot for not showing the Russians his gun, for not showing the Russians his phone. Another man did show them his, and the Russians shot him over something they found on it. Another man was shot for wearing camouflage pants. Another for asking soldiers what they were doing in Ukraine. I didn't know what to think of it. I didn't know or want to believe it. Most of the soldiers in the village were barely adults. Yet those who shot David Mirosson were barely adults themselves. And every night we heard even more gunshots. And every night we heard women screaming. Poor Milena was terrified. She kept beating herself up over heading to Hostomel before the war. Kiev, we were told, was still holding out with Hostomel. As we'd soon find out, Hostomel was completely lost. One evening, we had settled in the basement. Me, Olga, Lily, and Milena, who hid herself in the farthest corner. During the worst, we were always ready to hide Milena under the blankets, as if she was not here. And the Russians were rowdy that evening. Their gunfire and frenzied shouting echoed across the town. Suddenly we heard someone bang on the door, and mere seconds later it flew open. Milena hid herself immediately, and the rest of us jumped to our feet. We heard commotion coming from upstairs, from someone slow and messy descent. A Russian. When he stumbled into the basement, I recoiled from the stench of sweat and alcohol. He could barely stand as he looked at us. His sleepy blue eyes were almost white. "Good evening. So what's it going to be?" he slurred, as if continuing a point he made before, somewhere upstairs if not hours ago. "Are there any girls left in this town?" My heart sank. Lily and Olga just blinked at each other. The man stood at the exit, trapping us inside. His rifle was at his shoulder, way out of our reach. Then he moved across the basement, towards the bedding, where Milena was hiding. My heart sunk again. Luckily, Lilia spoke up. "What are you celebrating?" I was baffled at first, but then I too put the dots together. The smell of alcohol and the shouts outside. The soldier was barely standing when he came to us. As it turned out, that's why he went for the bedding. To land on it with a loud, tired groan. I couldn't breathe from strain. Milena was barely a meter away from him, hidden under a pile of blankets. "We took Hostomel. We took everything in Kiev. It's next, and soon you're president." He grinned and drew a thumb across his dirt-caked neck. "Him the rest the fucking Nazis." We had to keep the boy distracted and get him to leave us alone as soon as possible. So we got him even more drunk. "Luishka, did you hear that? They liberated Hostomel. Hostomel. I can't do that syllable for some reason half the time. Luishka. Luisha, did you hear that? They liberated Hostomel. Get our hero something to drink." Lily didn't need to ask him twice. And though we took out 4 cups, the Russian got most of the alcohol. He did not insist, but he didn't protest either. He drank sedated him and loosened his tongue. And the stories he told us were awful. The boy did not seem to come from a very happy household, and his home village somewhere in North Russia was sparse on young women. He said he was conscripted a year ago and was not even supposed to be in Ukraine, but he was having the time of his life. "Take whatever you want, eat whatever you want, fuck like girls, shoot every once in a while, and when I'll go back, they'll give me a medal for it." It lasted for so long. I was afraid Milena would suffocate under the blankets. But she did well. She later told us she was shaking the whole time, but I did not notice. And soon, the Russian could hardly string his words together. He leaned against the wall, his rifle belt started slipping from his shoulder. He barely even noticed. Just then, we heard someone else open and walk through the door. Another Russian. He, too, was armed. Siri, get the fuck up! Sarge is looking for you. The fuck are you doing here? Waiting some girls for the night like yesterday. I told the fucking sergeant where I was going. The man got onto his feet, grumbling under his breath. He winced at the crass exchange, but said nothing. This was not the first time nor place. This was not the time nor place to tell the youngsters to mind their language. Thankfully, the soldiers were about to leave anyway. Well, leave these old fat hags alone, you idiot. We found someone younger. Huh? I thought it said if she went down to 1. Did she just lose it anyway? Damn it. Milena was not looking good. News was getting harder to come by, with everyone staying home and the mobile connection failing us more often than not. But anytime we got news, it was all worse than before. Lilia and Olga could hardly calm her down. When they got together, they only magnified each other's fears. They all knew if the Russians came for us, there would hardly be anything we could do about it. And even if I had the weapon, I was a tired old man. Nobody expected me to fight the entire Russian army. One night, we all woke up hearing Russian vehicles moving on the road above us. Even after they had passed us, Milena could not sleep. She was afraid to move or even breathe. I had to distract her somehow. I settled into the corner next to Milena and tried to get her to talk. It was so glowing at first. It was very slow to glow. But I suppose I was non-threatening enough that she started to open up. She told me how much she hated the Russians, how much they took from her and her family already. She told me how much she missed her father. How when she was little, he tried his best to keep her from finding out about death. Whenever her pets disappeared, it was because they had made some miraculous escape to Hamsterland or Rabbitland, wherever they'd be happier. She was right. David was a good man, and he didn't deserve what happened to him, not one bit. When she cried, I hugged her and did my best not to join in. Eventually, Milena fell asleep. I covered up the best I could and tried to rise to my feet, but couldn't. I had too little strength left in me. Eventually, I drifted to sleep on the floor. The next morning, my back was not thankful for it. In the end, I managed to shield Milena from this war a little bit, and that's what mattered. Oh wow, she went up 2, I didn't expect that. The Mirzwan's escape. It was the second week of the war. 2 days ago, an artillery shell substation on the street next to ours. 2 days ago, an artillery shell hit the substation on the street next to ours, and since then we've had no electricity. To cook or boil water, I had to build a fire in our backyard. Olga and Milena were fixing to try and evacuate. I am telling you, there will not be a better time. What if the Russians come back to look for girls again? We will not be so lucky a second time. After that case, Milena wouldn't leave the basement anymore. She shuddered at any noise, and no matter how she tried to hide it, I knew that she was having nightmares every single night. I did not sleep well either. Memories of that evening kept surfacing. The more thoughts of what would happen if the drunk Russian found Milena made me sick to my stomach. We were lucky that Katya left for leave a long time ago. The Russians would never reach her there. And I thank God for that every day. Yeah, Lviv is very far to the west. I'm actually not sure how the fuck that's said because it's not a Y in there's language, so I'm actually not sure. Oh yeah, we've talked about it. It's too dangerous. The Russians firing at any cars they see. Lilia was against doing anything rash. She insisted that we wait for the official evacuation corridor. The problem was we didn't know if or when there would be one. It can't be possibly more dangerous than staying here, Orha insisted. She was always a good mother to Milena, and after David's death, I could understand her feelings. Living in a constant state of fear for your child wouldn't wish it upon my worst of enemies. If you want to sit and wait, that's fine. But we are leaving today. The conversation was over, and the Murozans went to pack up their things. In about an hour, they were ready to leave. We went out into the yard, not knowing what to say or to do. It was a strange feeling, looking at our friends and wondering if we'd ever see them again. In the last few weeks, the Murzians became like family to us. Shared hardship made us close. We hugged them, we said our goodbyes. Lilia hurried back into the basement. I think she wouldn't need to see her in tears. She became quite fond of Milena. I thought I'd miss her too. Our days would be even darker without her occasional smile. We were too sad to say or do anything in the evening, so we went to sleep early. And in the morning, we were woken up by loud screams from outside. It was Milena. She was calling for help. Me and Lilia ran out into the yard and saw her. She was barely standing on her feet, holding up her mother, whose clothes were stained with blood. Olga looked pale, and her left arm hung limp on her body. Oh my god, Milena, what happened? Lilia rushed to help the crying girl. I limped after to support Olga. My leg hurt like hell, but it was the last of my concerns at the time. What is a Russian BTR? They fired on us. The girl was in shock and barely stringed any words together. There is bodies on the streets with tied hands, like they were executed. Her shoulders shook as she balled into her hands. Me and Lilia exchanged shocked glances. We heard gunfire every night, but we couldn't imagine something like this. My wife came to her senses first. Lucia, bring her downstairs. I have to look at her wound. Well, obviously this. We're gonna run out of medicine, but... Back in the basement, we put Olga down on a mattress and turned on the flashlight to see what we were dealing with. That's when Lilia's first aid course came handy. Lucia, get the medkit. We must clean and dress the wound. Watching Lilia work, I tried to calm Milena down. Don't worry, honey. Mama will be alright. We have the medicine. It will help. It's been a few days since Olga was wounded. She was in the clutches of fever, and Lilia kept by her side, keeping a cold rag on her forehead. It barely helped. Olga needed medicine and professional medical help. At some point, I even tried pleading with the Russians, asking if they could help. They just laughed and said they wouldn't waste medicine on us even if they had enough themselves. From the looks of it, their special military operation against Ukraine wasn't going according to plan. What little news we kept getting suggested that the Russians weren't making any progress. Our military stopped their advance completely, and recruitment stations had civilians queuing up to them. People said there were more Ukrainian volunteers than weapons. That's not how a sentence works. People said there were more Ukrainian volunteers than weapons to give them. I'm not sure what context that would be. Like, van? I'm assuming that's supposed to be van, right? I'm assuming that was just an accidental mistake. I'm gonna assume that's the case. People said there were more Ukrainian volunteers than weapons to give them. Despite constant rocket strikes and shellings of peaceful cities, Ukraine held fast. But those were not the news at all. Those weren't all the news. For the last few days, rumors had begun to spread about another occupied town nearby. Bucha. What the Russians did to its citizens was beyond comprehensions. Even the Nazi occupation, for my father's occasional stories, couldn't compare to the senseless cruelty of the Russian military. And the ones in Hostomel kept telling us that they came to liberate their brother people. So far, mass murder, torture and rape were all I had seen and heard about the Russian world they were so eager to bring us into. Back home, I saw Lily and Milena having a cup of tea and talking about something. After all the stress she had been through, Milena spoke with a stammer. It turns into Britishness. Milena spoke with a stammer and cried more often than not, bubbly and full of life before the war. Now Milena was just a shadow of her former self. Luckily, my wife had worked with children her entire life. Being a school teacher, Milena was not a child, but Lily still managed to get through to her, like she always did to anyone. Now Lilia was telling Milena a funny story about our own daughter. And as it turned out, she spent the night at her friend's house. You don't understand. We had the entire town looking for her, and she just had the sound on her phone disabled. Oh, children. Milena smiled a little, and it was her first smile since the incident with her mother. I was glad to see her coming back to life a bit. I smiled at the story as well, and checked my phone. It suddenly had a weak connection. Anytime I had caught any, I tried to keep up with the news. And I could not believe my eyes when I saw it. Evacuation! Lily! An official evacuation from Hostomel! The basement went quiet. Lilia and Milena looked up at me with round eyes, and even Ulcha seemed to perk a little. Tomorrow at noon, there will be an evacuation corridor for civilians, either by car or by bus. They'll be waiting at the outskirts of town. Milena looked at her mother, then at me. We're going, right? Mom needs to see a doctor. Me and Lilia exchanged glances. Glances. Leaving our house behind was scary, but we could not stay, especially after the news from Bucha. We immediately had a silent understanding. Lily stroked Milena on the head. Of course, honey. Tomorrow night, we'll all be safe. The rest of the day was spent packing up for departure, and by morning, we were ready. We decided to go by car. That way, we'd be able to take more supplies, get to our destination faster. In times of war, transport could become an issue. And with my leg, reaching the evacuation buses with an injured woman in tow, we ran the risk of not making it. We loaded everything up into the car. We looked at our house one last time. We lived there for the better part of our lives, and leaving it behind was tough. The Mirzoans had it even worse. They weren't only leaving their house and home in Hostomel, they were leaving David. We set out with a very, very heavy heart. The ruined and looted Hostomel outside was a scene straight from a horror movie. On the outskirts, we passed a Russian checkpoint. They checked our papers, looked inside our car, but decided to let us through. Soon, we joined the evacuation convoy on the highway, and I began to feel the dread my constant companion of the last 2 weeks dissipate. Safe at last. I could scarcely remember the time. I could scarcely remember the road to Kiev. I think the entire time we were on the road, I kept looking out of the window. And the only thing I remembered was destroyed Russian vehicles. A lot of them. A whole damn lot. At a certain point, I was so overcome by anger, I wanted to limp my way back to Hostomel and strangle every single one responsible for my town's ruin. But this anger passed quickly when I looked at Lilia, Olha, and Milena. Peaceful at long last. For the first time in 2 weeks, we had nothing to fear. In Kiev, we immediately took Olga to the hospital. As it turned out, Lily learned a lot from her first aid courses. She did a good job cleaning and dressing the wound. Olga was on the road to recovery. While we sat at the hospital, Milena found us a train schedule, and in the evening we were already at the railway station. We had to wait a bit, but eventually we managed to board an evacuation train headed west. It was a long journey, about 13 hours in a cramped train car, but it was nothing compared to what we had already survived by then. Next day, we were in Lviv, where our Katya met her along with her fiance. Where we met Katya and her fiance. I don't think I've ever been happier. My wife and daughter held each other and cried while I looked at passing cars and people walking out around with their children. I could not believe my eyes. We were in a peaceful city. We were safe at last. I remember looking at, I think it was Bald and Bankrupt, looking at a video he had out of Ukraine. I think it was probably about this much time, actually, yeah. Out of the, through the war. I think it was like 2-3 weeks in. I think it was him. It might not be right. No, it was definitely him, yeah. And he was in, I saw a video of him going in, but then I also watched a video of him leaving. And he left on one of these trains from Kiev. And I mean, it was about what you'd expect, you know. There was just so many people on that train. Like, every car was truly cramped beyond, like, you think of crush load of mass transit where it's standing room only and everybody's inside of each other. This is like a vacuum sealed version of a Kipperton, you know. One of these trains. I think the car he was in, though, had a little more room. In fact, I know it did. It had a little more room in certain areas. So he was able to move around. Some other people were able to move around. And, you know, he has a camera. So, of course, he's, you know, going to take a little more room at that point because he has to hold it in front of him or whatever. And I, of course, I had mixed feelings about that because it's like, you're not one of the Ukrainian people that are just trying to get by in life. Like, it kind of feels weird that you got on that train too and you managed take a ticket from other people while all these other families are waiting on the train. But then again, even though they were still making people pay for tickets, they weren't checking it. They didn't care. So it's like he helped a bunch of other people and some families and stuff get on the train and crush themselves on last second, because of the fact that it didn't matter if they had a ticket or not. Nobody actually cared. Like, the ticket agents didn't technically care. So that was, it was good, but I also, of course, I was uncomfortable, disliked the fact that Ukraine was still charging their citizens to get on these trains, which was kind of fucked up, I think. But yeah, I don't know if they're still doing that. I'm sure they are, which is stupid, but if they're still charging the citizens. But yeah, you know, it was definitely a sight that, you know, it was still harrowing to see, even though it's also something that you would expect. You know, it's not at all unexpected or surprising to see that. It allowed, you know, loads of people at the station, the platform, that obviously can't fit on that train, so they have to wait for the next one. But they were running, I think, like is either every 15 minutes or like every 30 minutes or 45 minutes. It was something actually wildly short and efficient, so people didn't have to wait too long in the grand scheme. But yeah, like, yeah, it's something else, man. Now, here's the thing about Kyiv. A lot of these areas in Kyiv actually did get shelled and bombed and rocketed. There's, you know, damaged buildings and stuff there too. But for the most part, the city's probably about one of the safest major cities you have in the entire place. Even when it was surrounded, it wasn't that decimated. Like, obviously, Western media, was trying to dramatize the fuck out of it, because it sells. The more negative and the more dramatic and the more over the top and embellished they make stuff, the more clicks they get, and the more clicks they get, the more views they get. The more views they get, the more money they make, and the more money their advertisers make. And that's all it is here. Is it's a propaganda machine that's exclusively to make as much money as possible, to make as much profit as possible. That's it. So you can know that you can't truly ever trust any mainstream media here at all, or at the very least, if you have any trust, tiny little trust, like little grain of salt for little different things. You know, you got to learn to spot where the embellishments are, where the exaggerations are, and you should always try to listen to citizens before you'll ever listen to media, or ever listen to even governments and politicians and public figures, because it's going to be the most brutally honest you will ever see in any situation if you only ever pay attention and seek out and listen to citizens, because they will tell you everything they've been through. They know really what the extent of everything is, and you will never get embellishment. You always get that kind of lies and all the embellishment, all this other stupid bullshit from media. And it doesn't actually even matter if it's Western media, because obviously universally every nation's media is bought out, paid for, and for profit, and just for clicks. So that's the saddest part. And mainly, number one actually is propaganda. So just something to note. But yeah, so when you go through there, and in fact I even saw a video, I don't know if it was Boldenbecker, it might have still been him too as well, but I know I saw somebody else go through there as well, in Far East Ukraine, actually, literally in one of those two regions. He went to one of those towns right with the border with Russia that was supposedly, like, you know, completely under fire and getting decimated. It was fine. Like, yeah, you still saw and heard in the distance, you know, some Russian vehicles, but they were literally passing it by, and it was really fucking quiet and peaceful. Like, there really wasn't any destruction anywhere. So it was kind of weird to see that, because, you know, like, you know, both sides are destroying each other, you know, the region that they're focused on or whatever. And it's like, I didn't really see that. So it's just one of those things where it makes you realize, like, you know? And you even talk with some people there that were living there, and they didn't have any bias to either side. They didn't care. It was literally like anybody else anywhere in the world. They just want to be left alone to lead their own fucking lives in peace and quiet. Just live, you know? That was it. They didn't care. They didn't have any politics or anything, which is great. I think only one or two people did have politics, but that was it. So yeah, like, and that shows you that even those towns and those people, technically, they really aren't pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. They're really neither. They're just everyday simple people leading simple lives that just want to fucking survive. They just want to continue to live their lives as they always have, peacefully, quietly, day by day, without any kind of ruckus, you know? But you don't see that in media, of course, because it's got to be propaganda and it's got to be dramatized. So it's just the sad reality of it. The town of Hostomel fell under attack from the first day of the war. Its Antonov International Airport made it a prime target for the invasion, of course, as it would have allowed the Russian army to continuously airdrop personnel and vehicles to the outskirts of Kyiv. By the time the Russians managed to take the airport, it was rendered inoperable. Russian troops first set foot in Hostomel on February 25th, 2022, but encountered fierce resistance. By March 5th, 2022, however, the towns of Hostomel and Bucha were under complete occupation. This put the Russian military in position to threaten the city of Kyiv. Only the heroic defense of the Ukrainian armed forces prevented the disaster. Hostomel would only be liberated on April 2nd, 2022. Over the month of full occupation, the Russian armed forces had committed a large number of war crimes, including looting, summary execution, forced deportation, and rape. Summary execution? Not execution. Summary execution. Never heard of such a thing. What is that supposed to mean? These events have been corroborated by satellite footage, eyewitness accounts, and intercepted communications. The actions of the Russian troops are considered to be genocide. The exact number of victims is still being established. Officially, over 400 people from Hostomel remain missing. As of May 2022, the Kyiv Oblast has been completely liberated and people are starting to return. But in the south and east, the war continues. The end is not currently in sight. So there you go. That's episode 2 of Ukraine War Stories. That's the alternate Hostomel that I decided to play with. I'm probably not going to do Hostomel again. I'm probably going to focus on the next one on Bucha, because that's the next one in line as well. If you go to, say, new game, Bucha, and then it's Mariupol. If you enjoyed, you know the drill. Leave a like on the video, because it not only lets me know you enjoyed, but it also lets the algorithm of YouTube know that you enjoyed, which, of course, inevitably means that others will as well. Very appreciated. I'm very thankful for that and very helpful for all your support. And the support lately has been incredible. So thank you for that. I really, really appreciate it. It's very motivating. I hope to see you in whatever the next video may be. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope to see you around next time.